Hi folks, thank you for stopping by. If you found this video useful, please drop a like and consider subscribing. Now, let's jump into today's stories. Starting off with the disappearance of Joan Risch, Lincoln, Massachusetts, 1961. The autumn of 1961 in Lincoln, Massachusetts, felt like the quintessential mid-century suburban dream. Lincoln was a town of academics, professionals, and young families, a place of stone walls, historic orchards, and the serene proximity of Walden Pond. Among the town's respected residents were Martin Risch, an executive at a prominent paper company, and his wife, Joan, a 31-year-old graduate of Wilson College with a background in literary research and publishing. To their neighbors on Old Bedford Road, the Risches were a portrait of domestic stability. They had a 4-year-old daughter, Lillian, and a 2-year-old son, David. On the afternoon of October 24th, the sun was casting long, golden shadows over the neighborhood, and Joan was seen going about her mundane chores, tending to the children, hanging laundry, and waving to passing neighbors. But by 4:30 p.m., the dream had become a tableau of inexplicable violence. The mystery began when 4-year-old Lillian returned home from a neighbor's house to find the kitchen door open and her mother nowhere to be found. She allegedly told the neighbor, "Mommy is gone and the kitchen is covered in red paint." When the authorities arrived, they found a scene that looked like a violent struggle interrupted. The kitchen floor was smeared with blood. Droplets led from the kitchen to the master bedroom and out to the driveway. A telephone had been ripped from the wall and placed inside a wastebasket. Despite the quantity of blood, there were no signs of a break-in, no robbery, and no murder weapon. Joan Risch had vanished into the brisk New England air, leaving her 2-year-old son sleeping peacefully in his crib upstairs. The procedural investigation launched by the Lincoln Police Department and the state police was a descent into a labyrinth of contradictions. The blood evidence was confounding. The smears suggested that someone had been injured and then attempted to clean up the mess with a roll of paper towels, which were found partially used. However, the sheer amount of blood didn't necessarily indicate a fatal wound. A local mail carrier and a neighbor reported seeing an unfamiliar blue car in the Risch driveway earlier that afternoon, and several witnesses claimed to have seen a woman matching Joan's description wandering aimlessly near the local highway construction site. She appeared disoriented, holding her head, with what looked like blood on her legs. But by the time police arrived at those locations, the woman, if it was indeed Joan, had stepped off the edge of the world. As detectives dug into Joan's history, the case moved from a standard missing persons inquiry into a psychological mystery. Joan was a voracious reader, and a local librarian discovered a chilling detail. In the months leading up to her disappearance, Joan had checked out over 25 books focused on murders and mysterious disappearances. One book, in particular, featured a narrative where a woman staged her own disappearance, leaving behind a blood-smeared kitchen to start a new life. This discovery divided the investigation. Was Joan the victim of a random, brutal abduction by a stranger in a blue car, or was she a brilliant, frustrated housewife who had used her literary research skills to engineer a perfect exit from a life she no longer wanted? The voluntary departure theory was bolstered by the lack of any discovered body, despite a massive search of the surrounding woods and local reservoirs. However, those close to Joan were adamant that she adored her children and would never have left her 2-year-old alone in the house if she intended to vanish forever. The counter theory suggested a darker trauma, that an old acquaintance or a figure from her past had appeared at the door, leading to a struggle that moved from the kitchen to the driveway. The blood outside the house suggested that Joan had been alive when she left the premises, but whether she left on her own feet or was forced into a vehicle remained the pivotal, unanswered question of the 1960s. Today, the disappearance of Joan Risch is viewed as a landmark in understanding the hidden pressures of the mid-century American housewife. It is a story that refuses to be categorized. If she was killed, the perpetrator has evaded detection for 60 years, committing a perfect crime in broad daylight. If she walked away, she did so with a clinical precision that would make her the most successful missing person in history. Next story, the disappearance of Amy Lynn Bradley, Caribbean Sea, 1998. On the evening of March 21st, 1998, the Royal Caribbean cruise ship, Rhapsody of the Seas, set sail from Aruba, carving a path through the dark, warm waters of the Caribbean toward its next destination, Curacao. Among the 2,000 passengers on board was the Bradley family from Virginia, Ron, Iva, and their two adult children, Brad and Amy Lynn. Amy, a 23-year-old physical education graduate and a strong, competitive swimmer, was on the threshold of a new chapter in her life, having recently accepted a job offer back on land. The atmosphere was celebratory. The family had spent the evening dancing, laughing, and enjoying the live music of the ship's band. But as the sun began to rise over the horizon on March 24th, the celebration turned into a waking nightmare that has remained an open wound for over 2 decades. The timeline of Amy's final confirmed movements is chillingly brief. Around 5:15 in the morning, her father, Ron, woke up and saw Amy resting comfortably on the balcony of their suite. She was barefoot, wearing a casual top and shorts, seemingly enjoying the quiet, pre-dawn breeze. Ron went back to sleep for a short while, but when he checked again at 6 o'clock, the balcony was empty. Her shoes were still in the room, and there was no sign that she had planned an excursion. Amy Lynn Bradley had vanished into the thin, salty air while the ship was just miles off the coast of Curacao. The immediate response from the cruise line was a point of deep contention for the Bradley family. They pleaded with the ship's authorities not to dock or let passengers disembark, fearing that if Amy had been abducted, she was being spirited away right under their noses. However, the ship docked as planned. A full search of the massive vessel did not commence immediately, and by the time a thorough sweep was conducted, the window of opportunity had slammed shut. The initial theory proposed by many was that Amy had accidentally fallen overboard, but this was a conclusion the family refused to accept. Amy was an expert swimmer with no history of depression, and the railings on the Rhapsody of the Seas were designed to prevent such a fall. Furthermore, no body was ever recovered despite extensive searches of the surrounding waters by the Coast Guard, or USCG for short. In the years that followed, the case shifted from a missing person investigation to something far more sinister. Several credible sightings began to emerge, suggesting that Amy might have been taken against her will and forced into human trafficking. In 1998, just months after her disappearance, a man claimed to have seen a woman matching Amy's description on a beach in Curacao. She allegedly made eye contact with him, appearing terrified, before 2 men hurried her away. In 1999, a member of the United States Navy, or the USN for short, visited a brothel in Curacao and claimed a woman approached him, identified herself as Amy Bradley, and begged for his help, stating she wasn't allowed to leave. Fearing trouble, the sailor did not report the incident until after he had retired, a delay that cost the investigation precious momentum. The most haunting piece of evidence surfaced in 2005. The Bradley family received an email containing a photograph of a woman posing suggestively on a bed. The woman, referred to as Jasmine, bore a striking, almost undeniable resemblance to Amy Lynn Bradley. Forensic artists and members of the Federal Bureau of Investigation, or FBI for short, analyzed the image, noting that the facial structure and markings were remarkably consistent with Amy's. The photo suggested a woman who had been hardened by a difficult life, a stark contrast to the athletic, smiling young woman who had walked onto that cruise ship in 1998. It remains one of the most polarizing artifacts in the history of missing persons cases, acting as either a beacon of hope or a cruel taunt. Despite the efforts of private investigators and the high reward offered by the family, the trail has remained frustratingly cold. The case forced a massive shift in how the public perceives cruise ship safety and highlighted the jurisdictional complexities of crimes committed in international waters. For Ron, Iva, and Brad, the pain of the unknown is a constant companion. They have appeared on countless television programs, from Primetime to the Dr. Phil show, keeping Amy's face in the public eye in the hope that someone, somewhere, will have the courage to provide the final piece of the puzzle. The disappearance of Amy Lynn Bradley is a story that lingers in the minds of travelers, a cautionary tale about the illusion of safety within the floating cities of the sea. It is a narrative defined by a father's last glimpse of his daughter in the blue light of dawn and the agonizing silence that followed. The ocean is vast, and it keeps its secrets well, but the Bradleys continue to listen for an answer, refusing to let the memory of the daughter they lost be swallowed by the waves. Next story: The Murder of Yvonne Fletcher, London, UK, 1984. The morning of April 17, 1984, began as a routine deployment for 25-year-old woman police constable Yvonne Fletcher. Standing at just over 5 feet tall, Yvonne was a dedicated officer of the Metropolitan Police, or the MET for short, known for her cheerful disposition and professionalism. Her assignment that day brought her to the leafy, prestigious surroundings of St. James's Square in central London. The air was thick with the sounds of chanting and the rustle of placards as a small group of Libyan dissidents gathered to protest the regime of Muammar Gaddafi. The protest was taking place directly outside the Libyan People's Bureau, a building that served as the country's embassy. For Yvonne and her colleagues, the goal was simple: maintain the peace and ensure the safety of the protesters and the public. By mid-morning, the atmosphere in the square was tense but predictable. Protesters shouted slogans against the building's windows, while behind the stone walls of the bureau, the mood was reportedly one of simmering hostility. Suddenly, at approximately 10:18 a.m., the rhythmic chanting was shattered by the staccato burst of automatic gunfire. 11 shots rang out from a first-floor window of the embassy, spraying the crowd and the police line with high-velocity bullets. In the chaos that followed, bodies hit the pavement. Among them was Yvonne Fletcher. She had been struck in the back, the round inflicting catastrophic internal damage. Her colleagues scrambled to her side, their helmets rolling across the cobblestones as they tried to shield her. The image of her iconic police hat lying abandoned in the middle of the square would become an indelible symbol of a nation's collective grief. Yvonne was rushed to Westminster Hospital, but the internal injuries were too severe. She died on the operating table shortly after arrival. Back at the square, a dramatic and unprecedented siege was beginning to take shape. The British government was faced with a diplomatic and legal nightmare. An officer had been murdered in cold blood from within a foreign embassy, yet the suspects were shielded by the ancient and rigid laws of diplomatic immunity. For 11 days, the London police surrounded the bureau, their snipers perched on nearby roofs, while a tense standoff played out between the Home Office and the Libyan government. The resolution of the siege remains one of the most controversial moments in British foreign policy. Under the terms of the Vienna Convention on Diplomatic Relations, the British authorities were unable to enter the building by force or arrest those inside without creating a massive international incident. On April 27th, the Libyan occupants were allowed to leave the building, escorted to the airport, and deported from the United Kingdom. As they walked to their transport, some of them reportedly smiled, knowing they were escaping justice for the murder of a British police officer on British soil. The murder of Yvonne Fletcher led to the immediate severing of diplomatic relations between the UK and Libya, but for her family and her fiancé, who was also a police officer on the scene that day, the void left behind was permanent. For decades, the case remained an open wound. It wasn't until the fall of the Gaddafi regime during the 2011 Arab Spring that new investigators and journalists were able to enter Tripoli to search for answers. Files uncovered in the aftermath suggested that the order to fire on the protesters and the police had come from the highest levels of the Libyan government. In 2015, a man named Salah Ibrahim Abruk was arrested in the UK on suspicion of conspiracy to murder Yvonne Fletcher. However, in a crushing blow to the pursuit of justice, the case was dropped in 2017 because key evidence was withheld on the grounds of national security. The government claimed that disclosing certain information would pose a proportional threat to the public interest. The legacy of Yvonne Fletcher is one of courage and the frustrating limitations of international law. In St. James's Square, a granite memorial stands at the spot where she fell, always adorned with fresh flowers. It serves as a reminder that she was a young woman who went to work one Tuesday morning to protect the right of others to speak their minds, only to be silenced by those hiding behind diplomatic shadows. Her death forced the world to reconsider the boundaries of immunity and the price of political stability. While the legal files may be closed to the public, the memory of the little girl in the big police uniform remains a vital part of the history of London, a city that continues to honor her service while still demanding the justice she was denied. Next story. The murder of Rachel Nicholl, Wimbledon Common, UK, 1992. The morning of July 15, 1992, began with a deceptive sense of tranquility in the affluent London suburb of Wimbledon. The Common, a sprawling expanse of greenery, woodland, and open heath, was a sanctuary for locals seeking a moment of peace away from the urban bustle. Rachel Nicholl, a vibrant 23-year-old former model, was among them. She was enjoying a routine walk with her 3-year-old son, Alex, and their dog, Molly. The sun was filtering through the trees, the air was crisp, and for a moment, the world felt safe. But in the heartbeat of a summer morning, that safety was shattered. Rachel was brutally attacked and murdered in front of her young son in what would become one of the most high-profile and controversial cases in the history of the Metropolitan Police, or the MET for short. The crime scene was haunting. When passers-by found little Alex, he was clinging to his mother's body, repeating the phrase, "Wake up, mummy." The sheer brutality of the act, over 40 stab wounds, sent shockwaves through the United Kingdom. Public pressure on the police was immense. The media demanded an arrest, and the community demanded justice for a young mother whose life was stolen in broad daylight. This pressure created a crucible in which the investigation would begin to melt under the heat of expectation, leading detectives down a path that would later be scrutinized as a textbook example of tunnel vision. Lacking forensic evidence or eyewitness accounts that could provide a definitive description of the killer, the investigation turned to a tool that was relatively new to the MET at the time: criminal profiling. They consulted Paul Britton, a renowned psychologist, who helped create a profile of the type of man who would commit such a visceral crime. The profile suggested a man with deep-seated sexual frustrations and violent fantasies. As the police scoured their list of suspects, they became increasingly convinced that one man, Colin Stagg, was the perfect fit. Colin lived nearby, walked his dog on the Common, and possessed an unconventional lifestyle that investigators believed aligned with Britton's assessment. The problem, however, was that there was no physical evidence linking Colin Stagg to the scene. No blood, no DNA, no murder weapon. But the investigators were certain. Driven by this conviction, they launched a covert operation that would become infamous in British legal history. Codenamed Operation Edsel, it involved an undercover female officer using the alias Lizzie James. Her objective was to strike up a romantic relationship with Stagg, gain his trust, and ultimately coax a confession from him by playing into the dark fantasies outlined in the criminal profile. Over several months, Lizzie James exchanged letters and held meetings with Stagg. She crafted a persona of a woman attracted to danger and darkness, hoping he would mirror those traits back to her. While Stagg engaged in bizarre conversations and seemed eager to impress her, he never confessed to the murder. In fact, he often denied any involvement when the topic of Rachel Nicholl was broached. Despite the lack of a clear admission of guilt, the police pushed forward, interpreting his oblique comments as evidence of his culpability. In 1994, the case went to trial, but the judge, Mr. Justice Ognall, was scathing in his assessment of the police tactics. He described Operation Edsel as an attempt to incriminate a suspect by deceptive conduct of the grossest kind, and threw the case out before it could even reach a jury. For the next decade, Colin Stagg lived under a cloud of public suspicion, his name synonymous with a crime he did not commit. Meanwhile, the true killer remained at large, a shadow moving through the background of other lives. The investigation into Rachel's death went cold, a tragic monument to the dangers of fitting a person to a profile rather than following the evidence. It wasn't until the early 2000s that advancements in forensic science allowed for a breakthrough that would finally uncover the truth. Using improved DNA profiling techniques, scientists were able to detect microscopic traces of genetic material on Rachel's clothing that did not belong to Colin Stack. The profile now pointed elsewhere, to Robert Napper. Napper was already incarcerated at Broadmoor High Security Hospital for the 1993 murder of Samantha Bissett and her 4-year-old daughter, Jasmine. The horror of this realization was twofold. Not only was the real killer a man of extreme violence who had remained free to kill again after Rachel Nichols' death, but the police had actually interviewed Napper early in the investigation. He had been dismissed because he did not fit the initial, rigid profile as neatly as Stagg did. In 2008, Robert Napper pleaded guilty to the manslaughter of Rachel Nichols on the grounds of diminished responsibility. The case finally found its resolution, but the cost was astronomical. The lives of Samantha and Jasmine Bissett, the reputation and sanity of an innocent man, and 16 years of uncertainty for Rachel's family. Reflecting on the case of Rachel Nichols, we see a narrative of systemic failure born from the desperation for a quick resolution. It serves as a somber reminder of the importance of objectivity in the face of public outcry. The lush fields of Wimbledon Common are once again peaceful, and a memorial stands where Rachel's journey ended. Alex, the boy who survived that terrible morning, grew into a man who has shown incredible grace, eventually finding a way to forgive the failures of the past. Next story, The Milk Carton Kids, Solihull, UK, 1996. Imagine the suburban landscape of Solihull in the mid-1990s, a place of planned greenery, quiet cul-de-sacs, and a pervasive sense of post-war security. In the district of Chelmsley Wood, the air was often filled with the sound of children playing on the extensive areas of open parkland known locally as the Greens. In late 1996, the atmosphere was one of typical neighborhood routine, where the boundary between home and the community was fluid and the concept of stranger danger was a quiet background awareness. David Spencer, aged 13, and Patrick Warren, aged 11, were two young boys who lived in this landscape, characterized by their energetic presence and their inseparable friendship. On the evening of Boxing Day, December 26th, the air was sharp with the frost of a West Midlands winter, smelling of wood smoke and the cold, damp earth of the surrounding fields. The mystery began not with a sudden disappearance, but with a silent failure of the night to return them home. The boys were last seen together at a local petrol station, buying a packet of biscuits and moving with the purposeful, carefree gait of children on a holiday adventure. The neon lights of the station glowed against the dark, winter sky, a landmark of normalcy in a night that was otherwise quiet. When they failed to return by midnight, the atmosphere of Chelmsley Wood shifted from festive relaxation to a cold, creeping mobilization. The investigation was launched into a community that was suddenly aware of the vast, unlit spaces that bordered their homes. The parks, the construction sites for the developing business parks, and the dense thickets of the nearby woods. The search process was an exercise in localized endurance and the limitations of 1990s record keeping. Because the boys were considered streetwise and independent, the initial police response was tempered by the hope that they had simply gone to stay with friends. This delay meant that the vital, early window for forensic recovery was lost to the winter weather. For weeks, the faces of David and Patrick stared out from posters in every shop window, eventually becoming the first children in the UK to be featured on milk cartons in a nationwide appeal. The image of the milk carton kids became a somber registry of the city's collective hope, yet the physical tracks they had left in the frost had long since dissolved into the mud of the new year. The narrative of the case shifted significantly in 2006, when a forensic link was established between the boys' disappearance and a local man who lived on a nearby estate. This individual, Brian Field, was a figure who lived on the margins of the community, characterized by his history of calculated, predatory behavior. The files of the case were reopened, moving the focus from a standard missing persons report to a clinical, large-scale excavation. Detectives fanned out across the Solihull bypass, a stretch of road that had been heavily redeveloped since 1996. They looked for anomalies in the soil near a location where field had been known to work, sifting through thousands of tons of earth under the gray, brooding skies of the Midlands. The investigative weight was carried by the families and the local community, who refused to let the silence of 1996 become permanent. In 2021, a new wave of atmospheric searches was launched by volunteers, sparked by tips regarding a specific bit of land near the Jaguar Land Rover plant. The air was thick with the scent of wet clay and the sound of manual shovels as neighbors took the search into their own hands, a powerful demonstration of the collective memory of the district. They combed the edges of the woods and the redundant ground of the old business parks, looking for a singular piece of clothing or a buried clue that the police had missed. The geography of Solihull had changed. The trees were taller, the roads wider. Yet the silence of that Boxing Day night remained as absolute as the winter ice. The human element of the milk carton kids case is centered on the enduring dignity of the families, who have lived for nearly 30 years in a state of suspended grief. Their names, along with the names of David and Patrick, are etched into the soul of Chelmsley Wood, a landmark of a search that refused to be defeated by the passage of time. The files of the West Midlands Police remain active, utilizing advancements in thermal imaging and deep soil analysis that did not exist in the late 90s. Every few years, a fresh lead brings a wave of renewed forensic activity, sifting through the layers of the past for a truth that the modern world has yet to reach. Today, the petrol station still stands, illuminated under the night sky, and the greens of Chelmsley Wood are once again filled with the sounds of a new generation. The winter air still carries the sharp bite of frost every Boxing Day, a silent reminder of the night the rhythm of the neighborhood was broken. For those who know the history, the air near the business parks carries a weight of reflective awareness, a reminder of two friends who walked into the cold and never walked back. The town of Solihull continues to thrive, but the story of David and Patrick is kept by those who remain, a silent vigil for the light to finally reach the back edge of the fields. The investigation remains open, a testament to the persistent work of those who refuse to let the silence of the past stay absolute. As the evening settles over the West Midlands, the neighborhood sleeps with the knowledge that the truth is patient, waiting beneath the redevelopment and the shifting suburban soil. The streets are calm, the city continues to move, and the names David Spencer and Patrick Warren remain a bright, guiding light in the ongoing search for an answer that time cannot hide. Next story: the murder of Stephen Lawrence, London, UK, 1993. The suburban landscape of Eltham in the early 1990s was a world of quiet residential avenues, red brick terraces, and the steady, rhythmic hum of the South Circular Road. In April 1993, the air was crisp, carrying the cool dampness of a London spring and the faint, sweet scent of garden hedges starting to bud. Along Wellhall Road, the street lamps cast a warm, orange glow on the pavement, creating a visual grid that defined the nightly walk for thousands of residents. Stephen Lawrence, an 18-year-old with dreams of becoming an architect, moved through this environment with the quiet confidence of a young man returning home. He was waiting at a bus stop with a friend, the two of them leaning against the brickwork of a wall, talking about the day in the soft, blue light of the evening. It was a mundane moment of transit that sat at the heart of an orderly neighborhood, where the concept of a violent breach of safety felt entirely foreign. The mystery did not begin with a disappearance, but with an unprovoked, clinical assault that happened in the glare of the passing car headlights. At approximately 10:30 p.m., a group of local youths crossed the street, moving with a calculated, predatory speed. In a span of seconds, the sanctuary of the public pavement was violated, and Stephen was targeted for no reason other than the color of his skin. He managed to move nearly 100 yards down the road before the reality of his injuries halted his progress, the energy of his youth fading into the cold London night. When he was discovered lying on the pavement, the air in Eltham grew heavy with a collective, social claustrophobia. A murder had happened in plain sight, on a busy thoroughfare. yet the shadows of the night seemed to swallow the perpetrators whole. The investigation was launched into a community that was suddenly fractured by a profound cultural tension. For the Metropolitan Police, the narrative was complicated by a lack of immediate forensic restoration. Though tips from the local estate flooded in, names whispered in confidence to detectives, the clinical link between the suspects and the scene remained elusive in the early months. Detectives fanned out across the local housing estates, searching the apartments of the named individuals, but the 1990s lacked the digital monitoring that exists today. The air in Eltham was thick with a new kind of silence. Witnesses were afraid to step into the light, and the files of Operation Athena began to grow with reports of coincidences and shifting alibis that didn't yet lock into a conviction. The narrative of the case shifted away from the local street to the global courtroom of human rights and institutional accountability. The Lawrence family, led by Doreen and Neville Lawrence, maintained a relentless, dignified vigil that forced the nation to look into the darkness of the legal system itself. In 1999, the McPherson Report was released, a landmark document that identified institutional racism as a factor in the failure to secure justice. This autopsy of a systemic breakdown transformed the mystery from a criminal inquiry into a constitutional crossroads. The files revealed that the initial investigation had been hampered by a lack of rigor and a dismissal of vital evidence, leaving the perpetrators to move through the city with an unearned anonymity for decades. As the years passed, the search for forensic truth continued in the quiet labs of the Metropolitan Police. In 2008, a breakthrough arrived with the use of LC and DNA, low copy number, and microscopic fiber analysis. On clothing seized from the suspects' homes 15 years prior, scientists discovered tiny, singular fibers that matched Stephen's clothing, along with a microscopic speck of his blood. These fragments were so small they were invisible to the naked eye, yet they acted as a bridge across time, providing the material proof that the original 1993 investigation had failed to identify. The atmosphere of the case changed from a theoretical debate to a cold, scientific reality, leading to the conviction of 2 individuals in 2012. Today, Wellhall Road remains a busy hub of South London life. The memorial plaque for Stephen is etched into the stone where he fell, a quiet landmark in a neighborhood that has learned to live with its history. The architecture he never got to design remains a dream, yet the architectural changes he forced upon the British justice system are a permanent registry of his legacy. For those who walk past the bus stop on a cold April evening, the air carries a weight of somber reflection, a reminder that justice is patient and that the truth can survive decades in the fibers of a coat. The story continues in the ongoing work of civil rights organizations and the continued scrutiny of police accountability. The name Stephen Lawrence is synonymous with a generational shift in British culture, a movement that was born in the orange glow of an Eltham street lamp. As the evening settles over South London, the city moves with a collective memory that refuses to let the silence of 1993 remain absolute. The streets are calm, the buses run steadily into the night, and the name of the boy who wanted to build is remembered by a nation that finally learned to look. Next story, the Bling Ring burglaries, Los Angeles, California, 2008 to 2009. Imagine the Hollywood Hills as they appear in the late afternoon, where the jagged peaks of the Santa Monica Mountains are silhouetted against a neon pink haze, and the sprawling grid of Los Angeles glitters like a field of fallen diamonds. This is a landscape defined by visibility, wealth, and the manufactured proximity of celebrity culture. The air is dry and carries the scent of expensive eucalyptus and the distant, constant hum of the 101 freeway. In the late 2000s, this world was undergoing a seismic shift. The dawn of the social media era meant that the fortress-like privacy of the stars was being breached by a new kind of map, the digital trail of checked-in locations and real-time updates. It was in this environment of unprecedented transparency that a group of local teenagers began a crime spree that was as shallow as it was calculated, transforming the Hollywood dream into a boutique of easy access. The mystery began not in the dark of a basement, but in the brightly lit bedrooms of suburban Calabasas. A group of 7 teenagers and young adults, largely motivated by a fascination with the aesthetics of fame, began to track the schedules of their idols through paparazzi sites and fashion blogs. They realized that when a star was walking a red carpet in New York or filming on location in Europe, their multi-million-dollar mansions in the hills were left behind as empty, gilded stages. The bling ring began their excursions with a casual, terrifying ease. Their first target was the home of Paris Hilton, a residence that functioned as a temple to early millennial glamour. They entered through an unlocked door, moving through rooms filled with designer handbags, custom jewelry, and original art. They didn't just take. They lounged in the spaces, trying on the identity of the person they were robbing, absorbed by the thrill of existing in a space that was previously only accessible through a screen. The investigation was launched into a world of high-definition surveillance and low-level digital footprints. Over the course of a year, the group targeted the homes of Lindsay Lohan, Orlando Bloom, and Megan Fox, making away with over $3 million in high-end goods. The air in Hollywood grew thick with a new kind of paranoia. The stars realized that their gates and alarms were no match for a generation that viewed privacy as a concept that had long since expired. Detectives with the LAPD found themselves sifting through a narrative that was almost entirely devoid of traditional criminal logic. There was no underground fence for the stolen goods. The teenagers were wearing the items to parties, posting pictures in stolen dresses, and treating the loot like a communal wardrobe. The clinical violence of standard burglary was absent, replaced by a strange domestic intimacy. The suspect had spent hours in these homes, petting the dogs, drinking the water, and living a simulated version of the life they coveted. The breakthrough came through the very vanity that fueled the spree. As the group grew bolder, they began to boast of their acquisitions within their social circles. Informants provided tips that led detectives to a world of suburban excess that mirrored the homes of the celebrities they had targeted. When police executed search warrants in Calabasas and beyond, they found rooms overflowing with couture that had been reported stolen months prior. The narrative took on a surreal meta-quality. The teenagers became celebrities in their own right, their arrests and subsequent trials becoming the very kind of media circus they had once obsessively consumed. The human element was a jarring study in the disconnect between actions and consequences, a story of a generation that struggled to see the boundary between the digital image and the human reality of the people they were violating. The case inspired books and films, further immortalizing the suspects and keeping the story in the public eye. The victims, largely recovered but permanently unsettled, reinforced their security, moving toward the high-walled, impenetrable compounds that define the modern Hollywood elite. The group was eventually sentenced, their lives defined by a year of playing house in the most expensive homes in America, a narrative arc that ended in the cold, gray reality of the courtroom. Today, the hills of Los Angeles remain as beautiful and guarded as ever. The scent of jasmine still hangs in the air on summer nights, and the lights of the city continue to promise a kind of immortality that requires no physical key. But the digital landscape has changed. Security is now as much about data as it is about locks, and the transparency of the 2000s has been tempered by a hard-won caution. The bling ring mystery has found its place in the lore of the city, a reminder that fame is a currency that can be stolen but never truly owned. As the evening settles over the hills, the mansions stand in quiet vigil, watched over by cameras that never blink, while the truth of that year remains a vibrant, cautionary reflection of the era that created it. Next story, the Dunblane Massacre, Dunblane, UK, 1996. To understand the heart of this story, one must first picture the town of Dunblane as it existed in the mid-1990s. Nestled in the rolling, verdant hills of Stirlingshire, Scotland, it was, and remains, a place of profound, ancient quiet. The town is dominated by its medieval cathedral, a towering structure of gray stone that has stood watch over the Allan Water for 8 centuries. The air in early March carries a persistent highland dampness, the kind of mist that clings to the mossy stone walls and keeps the meadows a vibrant, deep green. It was a close-knit community where generations of families stayed, where neighbors recognized each other's gait from a distance, and where the local primary school was considered the safe, beating heart of the town's future. On the morning of Wednesday, March 13th, the atmosphere was typical for a Scottish spring. The sun struggled to pierce through a heavy, milk-white fog, and the children of Dunblane Primary arrived in their sweaters and raincoats, their voices a soft, energetic chatter in the damp playground. Among them was Class Primary 1, a group of 5- and 6-year-olds who were heading to the school gymnasium for their morning physical education lesson. The room was large, echoing, and filled with the innocent sounds of gym shoes squeaking on polished wood. It was a sanctuary of childhood routine, a space where the biggest concern was a missed ball or a tumble mat. But within this sanctuary, the peaceful narrative of the town was about to be interrupted by a force that the community could not have imagined. The mystery of that morning does not lie in the identity of the perpetrator, who was a local man known to the community, but in the failure of the systems meant to protect such a sanctuary. Thomas Hamilton was a man who lived on the periphery of the town's social life, a frustrated figure who had spent years organizing youth clubs that had eventually been shunned by local authorities due to his erratic and concerning behavior. He was a collector of firearms, a man who possessed a legal arsenal in a country that at the time had a much more lenient approach to handgun ownership. The air in Dunblane was thick with the unasked questions of how a man whose suitability for working with children had been formally questioned could still hold the keys to such power. At approximately 9:35 a.m., the silence of the school was shattered. In a few minutes of incomprehensible violence, the gymnasium became the site of the deadliest mass shooting in British history. 16 children and their teacher, Gwen Mayer, lost their lives in a moment of clinical, targeted destruction. The perpetrator then turned the final piece of his arsenal on himself, ending his own life before he could be brought to answer for the void he had created. When the emergency services arrived, they found a school that was plunged into a state of frozen shock, the sirens cutting through the misty Highland air with a sound that would remain embedded in the town's memory forever. The investigation that followed was not a hunt for a killer, but an autopsy of a systemic failure. The Cullen inquiry was launched, sifting through the years of correspondence between the police, the local council, and Hamilton himself. Detectives and legal minds looked at the psychology of a man who felt rejected by the very community he sought to influence. They scrutinized the laws that allowed high-capacity handguns to be kept in residential homes. The narrative shifted from a local tragedy to a national movement, as the parents of Dunblane transformed their grief into a powerful, quiet resolve. They launched the Snowdrop Petition, a grassroots effort that gathered hundreds of thousands of signatures, demanding a total ban on the private ownership of handguns in the United Kingdom. The atmosphere of the UK changed in the wake of Dunblane. The debate was no longer about abstract rights, but about the specific, undeniable safety of a gymnasium in a small Scottish town. The pressure from the community was so profound, so grounded in the moral weight of their loss, that it compelled the government to act with a speed rarely seen in Parliament. By 1997, the law was changed, effectively ending the era of legal handgun ownership in the country. The mystery of why the warning signs about Hamilton were ignored led to a fundamental overhaul of how individuals are vetted and how public safety is measured against personal freedom. The legacy of Dunblane is held within the quiet, respectful dignity of the town itself. The original gymnasium was demolished, replaced by a memorial garden, a space of contemplative beauty where the names of the 16 children and their teacher are etched into stone, surrounded by the soft rustle of the trees and the gentle flow of the Allan water. The town refused to let the event define its character, focusing instead on supporting the survivors and the families who had to learn to live with the silence of those 16 missing voices. Dunblane became a symbol of resilience, a town that showed the world how to respond to darkness with a collective, unwavering commitment to change. Today, the cathedral still stands watch, and the school remains a place of learning and life. The mist still rolls in from the hills on March mornings, but the air carries a different weight now, one of somber remembrance and a hard-won safety. The events of 1996 are not forgotten, but they are tucked into the history of the stone and the soil, a reminder of a time when the world was forced to look at itself and do better. The children who survived have grown, the teachers have moved on, and the town continues to find its peace in the rhythmic, ancient quiet of the Scottish countryside. The story of Dunblane is a story of a town that reclaimed its heart. It is a mystery of human behavior that was answered with a legislative promise that such a morning would never happen again. As the evening settles over the Stirlingshire hills, the memory of Gwen Mayer and her class remains a quiet, guiding light, a testament to the power of a community that stood together in the mist and demanded a safer future for all. The streets are calm, the cathedral bells ring out over the water, and the town sleeps with the knowledge that its greatest tragedy resulted in its greatest legacy of protection. Next story, the disappearance of Natalie Holloway, Oranjestad, Aruba, 2005. Picture the island of Aruba as it appeared in the late spring of 2005, a place where the jagged limestone cliffs of the north coast stand in stark contrast to the sugar-white sands of the south. The atmosphere is defined by the One Happy Island motto, a landscape of DVDV trees leaning perpetually toward the turquoise Caribbean, vibrant with the scent of tropical bougainvillea and the steady, cooling trade winds. Oranjestad, the capital, was a kaleidoscope of pastel-colored Dutch colonial buildings that glowed in the relentless golden sun. In late May, the island became a sanctuary for hundreds of American high school seniors celebrating their graduation. The mood was one of sun-drenched freedom, a rhythmic cycle of beach excursions by day and the neon-lit pulse of the Palm Beach district by night. In this setting, the very concept of danger felt impossible, masked by the bright holiday light. Natalie Holloway was an 18-year-old from Mountain Brook, Alabama, characterized by those who knew her as driven, high-achieving, and possessing a vibrant, empathetic spirit. She arrived on the island with her classmates, moving through the resort world of the holiday and with the effortless confidence of a young woman on the cusp of a university life. On the final night of the trip, May 30th, the students gathered at Carlos and Charlie's, a popular downtown venue, where the air was thick with the humidity of a Caribbean night and the loud, carefree bass of popular music. At approximately 1:30 a.m., Natalie was seen leaving the bar, getting into a silver car with three young men who were not part of her student group. It was a departure that, in the moment, seemed like a minor footnote to a night of celebration. But as the sun rose over the ocean the next morning, that footnote became the start of a mystery that would haunt the island for decades. The absence began not with a frantic call, but with a silent, empty seat on a departing plane. When Natalie failed to meet her classmates for the flight back to Alabama, the atmosphere of the island shifted from celebration to cold mobilization. Her parents arrived in Aruba within hours, sparking a search that combed every square inch of the 12-mile-long island. They looked into the salt flats of the north, the limestone caves along the rugged coast, and the construction sites of the burgeoning hotel district. The Aruban police force, accustomed to low rates of violent crime, was suddenly at the center of a global forensic gaze. They questioned the three young men last seen with her, local residents Joran van der Sloot and brothers Deepak and Satish Kalpo, whose stories began to shift like the wind-blown sands of Eagle Beach, moving from "we dropped her off" to "we left her on the shore," creating a narrative labyrinth with no clear exit. The investigative process was an exercise in profound frustration and international tension. Aruba operated under a legal system that required a high threshold for physical evidence before a long-term detention could be secured. Detectives processing the silver car found it immaculately clean, while Dutch Marines joined the search, using sonar to scan the dark, deep waters off the coast. They looked for a trace of her clothing or the jewelry she had worn that night, but the Caribbean Sea remained a vast, blue blank. The investigation was hampered by the transient nature of a tourist economy. Witnesses were flying out of the country, and the digital footprints of 2005 were sparse compared to the interconnected world of today. The files grew thick with contradictions, but empty of the physical proof needed to bridge the gap between suspicion and a courtroom. Over the years, the Natalie Holloway case became a permanent fixture in the collective memory of the United States and the Netherlands. Her mother, Beth Holloway, maintained a relentless vigil on the island, her presence a constant reminder of the unanswered questions that lingered in the salt air. The narrative took many dark turns, including a series of undercover recordings and public statements from the primary suspect that offered glimpses into potential truths, only for them to be retracted or proven to be fabrications. The case moved through the stages of a modern-day myth, a story of a paradise lost and a search for justice that refused to be silenced by the passage of time or the vastness of the sea. In 2012, a significant legal chapter closed when an Aruban judge declared Natalie legally dead, though the physical reality of her end remained hidden. The investigation into her disappearance remained open, a digital ghost in the cold case files. Then, years later, the primary suspect was involved in a tragedy in Peru, which reignited global interest and eventually led to a complex legal extradition process. It wasn't until 2023, nearly 2 decades after the night at Carlos and Charlie's, that a legal proceeding in a federal courtroom in Alabama provided the first formal acknowledgement of the truth. In a stunning admission as part of a plea deal, the primary suspect finally described the events on the beach, confirming a tragic end that had been suspected for 18 years. The legacy of Natalie Holloway is held within the changes she brought to the world of travel safety and the protection of students abroad. Her name is now synonymous with the Natalie Holloway Resource Center, an organization dedicated to helping the families of missing persons navigate the complexities of international searches. The island of Aruba has continued to flourish, its pastel buildings still bright under the Caribbean sun, but for many, the white sands of the south coast will always carry a somber weight. Natalie is remembered not just as a headline, but as a bright, ambitious daughter whose journey was cut short in a place meant for joy. Today, the trade winds still lean the DVDV trees toward the water, and the sound of the ocean remains as rhythmic and ancient as ever. The Carlos and Charlie's of 2005 is gone, but the memories of that May night are etched into the stone and the soil of the island. The case has found a form of closure in words, if not in physical restoration, and the truth has finally emerged from the shadows of the trade winds. Natalie's family has found a somber peace, knowing that the silence of the island has finally been broken. As the evenings settle over the Caribbean, the island remains a place of profound beauty, watched over by a history that has finally found its voice. Next story, the murder of Meredith Kercher, Perugia, Italy, 2007. The atmosphere of Perugia in the late autumn is one of medieval gravity shifted into a modern, vibrant pulse. Perched on a high, rugged hilltop in the heart of Umbria, the city is a labyrinth of steep stone staircases, arched subterranean passages, and sun-drenched piazzas that look out over a landscape of silver-green olive groves and rolling hills. In November 2007, the air was beginning to carry the sharp, damp chill of a mountain winter, smelling of wood smoke and the rich, espresso-scented breath of a town that lives in its cafes. Perugia was a sanctuary for international students, a place where the history of the Etruscans and the Renaissance met the frantic energy of youth. Among them was Meredith Kercher, a 21-year-old student from London with a bright, curious spirit, who had come to the city of chocolate to immerse herself in Italian culture and the beauty of the Umbrian life. The mystery began in a small cottage perched on the edge of a ravine, a quiet residence that looked out over the sprawling valleys below. On the morning of November 2nd, the house was supposed to be a place of recovery after the celebrations of Halloween. Instead, the stillness of the hillside was broken when the postal police arrived to return a found mobile phone, only to discover a scene that felt suspended in a terrifying, clinical freeze. Meredith's bedroom door was locked from the inside, and when it was eventually opened, The vibrant life of a young woman had been replaced by a silence that would consume the international media for the next decade. The investigation was launched into a city that was suddenly on edge, as the sanctuary of the stone cottage was scrutinized by forensic teams in white suits, their presence a stark contrast to the ancient, weathered walls of the neighborhood. The investigation was an exercise in linguistic and cultural tension, unfolding under the immense pressure of the world's gaze. Detectives focused on the 3 other residents of the cottage and their immediate social circles, looking for a narrative that matched the violence of the scene. They found a singular DNA profile that belonged to a local man, Rudy Gede, but the narrative quickly branched into a complex, psychological labyrinth involving Meredith's roommate, Amanda Knox, and her boyfriend, Rafael Salcido. The forensic evidence was sparse and heavily debated. A kitchen knife, a clasp from a garment, and a footprint in the dust. Every lead was interpreted through a different lens, creating 2 parallel stories that the Italian court system would spend 8 years attempting to reconcile. The human element of the case was often lost in the sensationalized headlines of the angelic face and the Foxy Knoxy narrative. Yet for the Kircher family, the story remained one of a quiet, irreparable void. Meredith was a woman of intellect and grace, a daughter who had mastered the Italian language and embraced the community with a genuine warmth. The files of the case became a record of a tragedy that happened in the most private of domestic spaces, a story that highlighted the vulnerability of those who live between worlds. As the trials moved from conviction to acquittal, back to conviction, and finally to a definitive exoneration by the Italian Supreme Court in 2015, the only certainty that remained was the absence of the girl from South London who had wanted to see the world. The legacy of the Meredith Kircher case is held within the reform of forensic standards and the international conversation regarding the ethics of pretrial media coverage. Her name is now a somber landmark in the history of criminal justice, a reminder of the fragility of truth when it is filtered through the lenses of different nations. Perugia has returned to its rhythmic, ancient cycle. The olive trees still silver in the wind, and the stone staircases are once again filled with the energetic chatter of students. But the cottage on the edge of the ravine remains a silent witness to a night that the legal system could never fully decode. Today, the air in Umbria remains crisp and clear, and the Cathedral of San Lorenzo still stands watch over the central piazza. Meredith is remembered not for the darkness of the cottage, but for the light of her ambition and the courage of her curiosity. The mystery has found its final legal resolution, yet the atmosphere of the case remains in the quiet, reflective moments of those who knew her. As the evening settles over the hilltop, the city of Perugia sleeps with the knowledge that some secrets are kept by the stones, while the names of those we lose stay bright in the collective memory, as constant as the stars over the Apennines. Next story, the Yorkshire Ripper, West Yorkshire and Manchester, UK, 1975 to 1981. The industrial landscape of West Yorkshire in the mid-1970s was a world of heavy woolen mills, red brick chimneys, and steep, terraced streets that climbed the hills of Leeds and Bradford. The air was often thick with a damp, coal-scented smog that clung to the soot-stained stone, turning the nights into a blurred palette of amber street lamps and deep, impenetrable shadows. It was a time of economic transition, where the vibrant hum of the textile era was fading into the stark reality of the winter of discontent. In the narrow alleyways and the quiet thoroughfares of the red light districts, a new kind of silence began to take hold. A silence fueled by a nocturnal predator whose movements through the fog seemed as erratic as they were lethal. The mystery did not begin with a name, but with a growing, cold realization across the northern cities of Leeds, Bradford, and Huddersfield. Between 1975 and 1980, a series of violent departures shook the working-class communities, targeting women who moved through the city streets after dark. The pattern was hidden at first by the geography of the crimes. The victims were found in construction sites, overgrown allotments, and the derelict edges of the city center. The narrative of the region was one of resilience, yet within that resilience, a climate of total, domestic fear began to settle. The Yorkshire Ripper had entered the national consciousness, a specter whose clinical detachment from his actions baffled the Victorian-era sensibilities of the local constabularies. The investigative process was an exercise in monumental frustration and the limitations of 20th-century manual tracking. Without the aid of modern databases, the Metropolitan and West Yorkshire Police were forced to rely on millions of index cards, a physical paper labyrinth kept in the Millgarth police station. Detectives conducted over 30,000 interviews and tracked hundreds of thousands of vehicles, yet the sheer volume of data acted as a shroud for the truth. The air in West Yorkshire grew heavy with a collective, social claustrophobia. Women were warned not to walk alone, and the lights of the terraces stayed on late into the night. It was an era of reclaim the night, marches, where the vibrant life of the city was reclaimed from the darkness, one protest at a time. A significant diversion in the case occurred with the arrival of the Wearside Jack letters and tapes. An anonymous sender, speaking with a distinct Geordie accent, claimed to be the perpetrator, leading the investigation on a 3-year detour into the Northeast. The audio was analyzed by phoneticians with a clinical intensity, shifting the focus of the manhunt away from the local Yorkshire dialects. This voice of a ghost distracted the best efforts of the force, allowing the actual perpetrator to move freely within the very streets that were being patrolled by thousands. The narrative was no longer just about the crimes, but about the failure of the system to identify a stranger who was hidden by a hoax. The breakthrough finally came in January 1981, not through a sophisticated forensic linkage, but during a routine patrol in the city of Sheffield. Peter Sutcliffe, a local HGV driver with a quiet, unremarkable exterior, was stopped in a light blue Rover with false number plates. When he was taken into custody, the forensic puzzle of 5 years was solved in a single weekend. The man who had terrorized the North was found to be a driver who knew the back roads of the M62 corridor like the lines of his own palm. His home on Garden Lane in Bradford was a study in suburban mundanity, the residence of a man who worked hard by day and navigated the urban darkness by night. The trial at the Old Bailey revealed a record of human vulnerability and a series of missed opportunities that haunted the police for decades. It highlighted the disconnect between the official narrative and the ground-level reality of the women who were living under the threat. The Yorkshire Ripper files were subsequently moved into the archives of New Scotland Yard, serving as a textbook study on the necessity of centralized data and the dangers of investigative tunnel vision. The families of the 13 women who lost their lives were remembered for their extraordinary dignity, their voices serving as a permanent registry of lives that were more than just a headline. Today, the industrial smoke has cleared, and West Yorkshire has been transformed into a modern cultural hub. The mills have been converted into galleries and lofts, and the narrow streets are filled with the white light of a safer digital era. Yet for those who lived through the late 70s, the memory of the Ripper years remains embedded in the stone of the cities. The case is a reminder that the most profound dangers are often the ones that look the most familiar, hidden in the cabs of lorries and the routine of the workday. The story of Peter Sutcliffe is now a closed chapter in the history of British crime, yet the atmosphere of that era lingers in the mist that still rolls over the Pennines. The cities are safe, the night is vibrant, and the shadows have been pushed back by the light of a hard-won collective memory. As the evening settles over Leeds, the stone walls stand in quiet vigil, a testament to a time of resilience and the eventual emergence of the truth from the thickest fog. Next story, the Sherry Papini incident, Redding, California, 2016. The atmosphere of Shasta County in the late autumn is defined by the immense, rugged beauty of the Trinity Alps and the looming, snow-capped presence of Mount Shasta. In the city of Redding, the air in early November is crisp and thinning, carrying the sharp scent of pine needles, drying brush, and the cool, damp breath of the Sacramento River. It is a landscape where the suburbs blend seamlessly into the wild, a place of gravel turnouts and dense manzanita thickets that hide the horizon. Sherry Papini, a 34-year-old mother known for her vibrant, energetic presence in the community, moved through this environment with a routine familiarity. On the afternoon of November 2nd, she left her home for a solitary jog, her route tracing the quiet semi-rural roads that navigate the edges of the forest. The mystery began not with an observation, but with a silent, empty space in the residential rhythm of the day. When Sherry failed to pick up her children from daycare, a frantic search of her jogging route revealed only her mobile phone and earbuds discarded in the grass near a rural intersection, their wires tangled like a discarded signature. The night air was freezing, and the forest bordering the road was suspended in a deep, rhythmic silence. When the sun rose on November 3rd, the domestic sanctuary of Redding was revealed to have a void that the massive, communal search efforts could not fill. For 22 days, the investigation fanned out across the Northern California wilderness, sifting through the layers of a missing person's life under the glare of a national media storm. The narrative took a jarring turn on the morning of Thanksgiving, when Sherry was discovered on the side of a highway in Yolo County, nearly 150 miles to the south. The atmosphere of her reappearance was one of profound shock. She was found emaciated, bound with chains, and branded with a clinical violence that defied the logical expectations of the community. Her hair had been chopped off, and she spoke of a kidnapping by two anonymous women who had kept her in a dark, isolated room. The air in Redding grew heavy with a collective, social paranoia. The mystery was no longer about a missing person, but about a phantom threat that moved between the cities of the coast. Detectives fanned out across the state, searching for a dark SUV and a hidden cellar. Yet the geography of her story offered no physical landmarks that the police could verify. The investigation moved with the speed of a modern forensic offensive, sifting through millions of lines of digital data and genetic profiles. Detectives looked at the forensic evidence seized from her clothing, hair and DNA that did not belong to the suspect she described. As the years passed, the search turned away from the highway and inward toward the digital tracks left in the months leading up to the jog. In 2020, using advancements in forensic genealogy that matched the DNA to a distant relative, the narrative was fundamentally realigned. The bridge led not to a dark cellar, but to a quiet residence in Southern California where an old acquaintance lived. This material proof transformed the mystery into a cold, scientific autopsy of a deception, revealing that the sanctuary of the forest had been used as a stage for a staged disappearance. As the legal proceedings unfolded in 2022, the focus shifted to the psychology of a hoax that had consumed the resources of an entire state. The trial revealed a story of a woman who had meticulously curated her own trauma, moving through her captivity with a calculated intent to deceive her community and her family. The Sherry Papini files were transformed from a survival story into a textbook study on the fragility of public trust and the capacity for personal secrets to be curated as global headlines. The human element was a jarring study in the disconnect between the image of a supermom and the human reality of the actions she had taken in the quiet hours of the afternoon. Today, the jogging trails of Redding remain as beautiful and sun-drenched as ever. Mount Shasta still stands watch over the valley, and the scent of pine still defines the autumn mornings. The whitewashed walls of the suburban homes glow in the light. Yet for those who know the history, the air carries a weight of reflective awareness, a reminder that justice is patient and that the truth can survive years of curated silence. The geography of Shasta County hasn't changed, but the culture of the community has been tempered by a hard-won caution. The mystery has found its final legal resolution, yet the atmosphere of that November morning remains in the quiet, reflective moments of those who understand the endurance of the truth. As the evening settles over the valley, the city sleeps with the knowledge that some secrets are kept by the self, waiting for the light of modern science to listen to the DNA. The wind sighs through the manzanita, the stars come out over the peaks, and the memory of 2016 remains a quiet, guiding light in the ongoing search for an answer that time can never hide. Next story, the disappearance of Kristen Smart, California, 1996. Imagine the central coast of California in the lingering, late-night hours of a Memorial Day weekend. The air in San Luis Obispo is defined by its Mediterranean softness, a gentle, cooling breeze that carries the scent of eucalyptus, sea salt from the nearby Pacific, and the damp, earthy fragrance of the surrounding rolling hills. In May 1996, the atmosphere at California Polytechnic State University was one of transition, where the academic year was drawing to a quiet close and the energy of student life was shifting toward the freedom of the summer. Kristen Smart, a 19-year-old freshman from Stockton with a vibrant, energetic spirit, moved through this world with the ease of a young woman finding her place. On the night of May 25th, the campus was quiet, bathed in the soft, orange glow of the street lamps that lined the walk back toward the dormitories. The mystery did not begin with a disturbance, but with a silent, empty space in the residential rhythm of the campus. Kristen was last seen around 2 a.m., walking back to her dormitory after an off-campus party. She was accompanied by 3 other students, 2 of whom split off toward their own halls, leaving Kristen with a singular companion, Paul Flores, to navigate the final leg of the dark, uphill climb. The night air was cool, and the campus was suspended in the deep, rhythmic sleep of a holiday weekend. Somewhere in the few hundred yards between the street and the entrance to Muir Hall, Kristen vanished. There were no witnesses to a struggle, no discarded items, and no sign of life. When she failed to call her family the next morning, a ritual she never missed, the domestic sanctuary of the campus was revealed to have a void that the morning sun could not illuminate. The investigation was launched into a landscape that moved with a slow, administrative caution. Because it was a holiday weekend, the initial police response was tempered by a belief that a 19-year-old might have simply extended her stay off campus. This delay meant that the vital, early window for forensic restoration was lost to the movement of thousands of students returning to their routine. The search eventually fanned out across the steep, golden hillsides of the campus and into the dense oak groves of the surrounding canyons, yet the terrain offered no clues. The investigative weight shifted toward the last person to see her, sifting through the layers of a student life for a motive that remained as elusive as the coastal fog. The air in San Luis Obispo grew heavy with a collective, social claustrophobia. The mystery lived in the dorms everyone walked past, yet no room offered an answer. The narrative of the case shifted away from the university to a residential home in nearby Arroyo Grande. Detectives fanned out across the backyard of the suspect's family home, looking for a track in the soil or an anomaly in the domestic landscape. They utilized search dogs that signaled towards specific corners of the yard, yet the 1990s lacked the ground-penetrating radar precision of the modern era. The files of the case became a record of thousands of hours of witness interviews and forensic theories, looking for a singular piece of evidence that could bridge the gap between suspicion and the courtroom. But the soil in Arroyo Grande remained as ancient and silent as the cliffs of the coast, frustrating a search that lasted for 25 years. The breakthrough finally arrived not through a sudden discovery, but through the patient, atmospheric work of a podcast that reignited public interest and the tireless advocacy of the Smart family. In 2021, the Digital Vigil sparked a new forensic offensive. Using modern archaeological techniques, detectives conducted a large-scale excavation beneath the deck of the Arroyo Grande home. In the quiet, shaded soil that had been shielded from the sun for decades, they discovered soil disturbances and biological traces that acted as a silent witness across time. This material proof transformed the mystery from a cold case into a clinical, scientific reality, leading to the identification and arrest of the individual who had walked into the night with her a quarter-century prior. Today, the hills of San Luis Obispo remain as beautiful and sun-drenched as ever. Muir Hall still stands, and the energetic chatter of a new generation of students fills the walkways every May. The whitewashed walls of the university glow in the afternoon sun. Yet for those who know the history, the air carries a weight of reflective awareness, a reminder that justice is patient. The geography of the campus has changed. New buildings have risen, and the trails are now monitored by a digital era. but the name Kristen Smart is etched into the stone and the soul of the Central Coast, a landmark of a search that refused to be defeated by time. The mystery has found its final legal resolution, yet the atmosphere of the case remains in the quiet, reflective moments of those who understand the endurance of a family's love. As the evening settles over the rolling hills, the city sleeps with the knowledge that the truth was found in the persistence of memory and the power of modern science to listen to the soil. The wind sighs through the eucalyptus trees, the stars come out over the Pacific, and the memory of that May morning remains a quiet, guiding light in the ongoing search for the answers that define our sense of safety. Next story, the Walker family murders, Osprey, Florida, 1959. The Gulf Coast of Florida in the late 1950s was a landscape defined by its humidity, its blinding white sands, and a pace of life that mirrored the slow, warm drift of the tide. In the small community of Osprey, just south of Sarasota, the air was heavy with the fragrance of orange blossoms and the salty tang of the mangroves. It was a frontier of post-war domesticity, where families lived in modest ranch-style homes surrounded by palmetto scrub and pine woods. Cliff and Christine Walker, along with their 2 young children, were the embodiment of this era, a young family building a life in a place that felt perpetually sunny and safe. But on the Saturday before Christmas, the warm Florida breeze carried a sudden, inexplicable chill. The day had been spent on the simple errands of the holiday season. Cliff had been out checking on properties, while Christine and the children had been preparing for the upcoming festivities. When a friend arrived at the Walker home on the morning of December 19th, expecting to meet them for a planned outing, they found the house wrapped in an unnatural silence. The front door was unlocked, and inside, the radio was still playing a faint, cheerful broadcast of Christmas music that echoed through the rooms. But the family was gone from the living spaces. In the bathroom and the bedrooms, a scene of clinical, terrifying violence was discovered, one that suggested the family had been intercepted in the most private moments of their domestic routine. The investigation began in a climate of total community shock. In 1959, the idea of a family being targeted inside their own home was almost beyond comprehension. Law enforcement arrived to a scene that offered few answers but many haunting details. There was no sign of a forced entry, suggesting either a known visitor or a moment of misplaced trust. Christine's Sunday dress lay on the bed, and a high-heeled shoe was found discarded on the floor, indicating a struggle that had moved through the narrow hallways of the ranch house. The perpetrator had vanished as quietly as they had arrived, leaving the red clay driveway as the only silent witness to the departure. Detectives from across the state converged on Osprey, sifting through the lives of the Walkers for a motive that didn't exist. They were a family with no enemies, no debts, and no hidden scandals. The search for a suspect led investigators into the dark underbelly of the Florida transit system, the hitchhikers and drifters who moved along US 41. In a remarkable turn of historical coincidence, the investigation briefly crossed paths with the infamous In Cold Blood case occurring simultaneously in Kansas. Perry Smith and Dick Hickok were known to be in Florida at the time, and their proximity to the Walker home on that fateful weekend sparked a theory that has lasted for decades. Forensic science of the time, however, could not bridge the gap between geographic presence and physical proof. As the years passed, the Walker home remained a site of somber curiosity before eventually being cleared away. The memory of the family became a part of the local landscape, a story told in hushed tones during the long, humid summers. The evidence sat in cold storage in Sarasota, consisting of blood-stained clothing and fragments of ballistic material that the 1950s could not decode. The case became one of the oldest cold cases in Florida history, a digital file that modern detectives would revisit whenever a new forensic breakthrough reached the headlines. In 2012, a significant effort was made to utilize advances in DNA profiling. The bodies of Smith and Hickok were exhumed in Kansas to provide samples for comparison against the material recovered from the Walker home. The community held its breath, hoping that 50 years of silence would finally be broken. Yet, the results were inconclusive. The samples were too degraded by time and the Florida heat to provide a definitive match. The bridge to the past remained unbuilt, leaving the truth of who entered the Walker home that morning suspended in the mist of the mid-century. Today, the site in Osprey has been reclaimed by new growth and modern developments. The orange groves have largely vanished, replaced by suburban expansion, yet the atmosphere of the mystery lingers in the quiet of the coastal nights. It remains a story of a lost era, a moment when the perceived safety of the American home was shattered by a stranger who left no name. The Walker family is remembered not for the tragedy, but for the life they were building in the sun. The case remains open, a testament to the persistent search for justice that refuses to let a family be forgotten, waiting for a final answer to drift in with the evening tide. Next story, the disappearance of Andrew Gosden, London, UK, 2007. The atmosphere of South Yorkshire in September 2007 was one of settled, early autumn routine. In the town of Doncaster, the morning air was beginning to carry a familiar dampness, and the streets were filled with the steady movement of students heading toward the local schools. Andrew Gosden, a 14-year-old with a gift for mathematics and a quiet, unassuming nature, moved through this world with the predictability of a young man who was anchored to his home and his family. He was a student of high intelligence, known for his love of heavy metal bands and his signature black Slipknot t-shirt. On the morning of September 14th, he left his house as he always did, but instead of walking to school, he waited in a local park until his parents had gone to work, then returned home to change his clothes. The mystery began to unfold not with a moment of chaos, but with a series of deliberate, quiet actions. Andrew went to a nearby ATM, withdrew nearly his entire savings, £200, and walked to the Doncaster train station. There, he purchased a one-way ticket to London King's Cross. When the ticket clerk asked if he wanted a return, Andrew declined, a detail that has been scrutinized for over a decade. Was it the simple oversight of a teenager, or a sign of a journey with no intention of a backtrack? He boarded the GNER train at 9:05 a.m., leaving behind his mobile phone and his chargers, taking only his shoulder bag and the quiet resolve of someone heading toward a specific destination. At 11:20 a.m., the graininess of CCTV footage captured the last known image of Andrew Gosden. He was seen leaving the main entrance of King's Cross Station, his thin frame and black clothing blending into the chaotic, vibrant rush of London. The city on that Friday was a sea of people, a sprawling metropolis that can make a stranger feel entirely invisible. The air inside the station was filled with the smell of diesel, coffee, and the electric hum of the underground. Andrew walked out into the London light, and in that moment, the narrative of his life encountered a permanent, silent break. The investigation was hampered by a tragic delay in the recovery of surveillance data. Because Andrew was a model student with no history of running away, it was days before the severity of his absence was fully realized. By the time the police turned their focus to London, many of the CCTV loops in the surrounding area had been overwritten. Detectives were left with a massive, urban jigsaw puzzle with the most vital pieces missing. They looked for sightings in music venues, in the parks of Camden, and at the gatherings of the rock community he admired. They followed thousands of leads, looking for a 14-year-old who appeared to have been swallowed by the sheer scale of the capital. Over the years, the search for Andrew has become one of the most prominent missing person cases in British history. His face has stared out from posters in every major train station, a constant reminder of the unanswered questions that linger in the air of King's Cross. Detectives scrutinized the possibility of an online lure, yet Andrew's computer showed no signs of secret communications. He had no digital footprint to follow. The case took a significant turn in late 2021 when two men were arrested in connection with his disappearance, leading to a frantic renewal of hope. Yet they were eventually released without charge, leaving the files to return to their state of suspended animation. The legacy of Andrew Gosden is held firmly by his family, who have maintained a vigil of hope and advocacy for missing people that has inspired the nation. His room in Doncaster remained a time capsule of 2007 for years, a space filled with books, music, and the remnants of a childhood that ended in a morning commute. The mystery serves as a sobering reflection on the anonymity of the modern city and the vulnerability of those who move through it alone. Today, King's Cross has been renovated, turned into a bright, modern cathedral of glass and steel. The entrance where Andrew was last seen is unrecognizable now. Yet the atmosphere of the station still carries that sense of transition, of thousands of stories beginning and ending on the platforms. The case remains a living investigation, a search for the why and the where that has eluded the best efforts of the Metropolitan Police for 17 years. Somewhere in the vast geometry of London, the truth of that September day is kept, waiting for a breakthrough to clear the mist. Next story, the Redhead Murders, USA, 1978 to 1992. To understand the Redhead Murders, one must visualize the vast, sprawling network of the American interstate system during the late 1970s and 1980s. Imagine the hum of tires on asphalt, the rhythmic passing of mile markers, and the neon glow of truck stops illuminating the darkness of the Appalachian foothills. This was an era of transition, a time before digital connectivity, when the highways were lifelines of transit for thousands of people who moved from state to state with little more than a map and a thumb in the air. The air in these regions, from the humid corridors of West Virginia to the rolling hills of Tennessee and Kentucky, carries the scent of pine, diesel smoke, and the heavy mist that often settles in the mountain gaps. It was within this sprawling, interconnected landscape that a series of discoveries began to haunt law enforcement, creating a mystery that spanned decades. The narrative began to coalesce around a striking commonality. Victims discovered along major thoroughfares, many of whom possessed naturally red or reddish hair. The first identified case that drew national attention occurred in 1983 along Interstate 40 in Wetzel County, West Virginia. A young woman was found in the quiet, wooded edge of the road. She was a stranger to the area, a traveler in a landscape that didn't know her name. For years, she was known only by the setting of her discovery, but her red hair became a silent marker of her identity. Investigators found themselves looking at a map that stretched across state lines, realizing that the geography of the crime wasn't defined by a single town, but by the roads that connected them, I-75, I-40, and I-81. In early 1985, the frequency of these discoveries increased, creating a climate of intense scrutiny within the law enforcement community. In Campbell County, Tennessee, a discovery was made along I-75 near a scenic lookout that overlooked the rugged beauty of the mountains. A short time later, in Kentucky, a similar find was made along the same interstate. The investigation began to focus on the transient nature of the victims and the potential that a single individual was using the vast freedom of the highway system to move undetected between jurisdictions. The investigation was complex, hampered by the era's lack of centralized databases. Files were shared via mail. Evidence was stored in cardboard boxes in small-town sheriff's offices, and communication between states was a slow, deliberate process of piecing together fragments of a life lost. The human element of these cases began to surface as the identities of some women were finally restored. In 1984, the discovery of a young woman in Arkansas led investigators to Lisa Nichols. She had been a resident of West Virginia, a mother who had left home to travel. Her identification allowed the narrative to shift from Jane Doe to a woman with a history, a family, and a reason for being on the road. It grounded the mystery in reality, highlighting the vulnerability of those who relied on the hospitality of strangers or the convenience of hitchhiking during a more open, trusting time in American travel. Each identified victim offered a glimpse into a life, waitresses, students, and travelers, who shared nothing but a color of hair and a presence on the highway. As the 1980s progressed, the case took on an atmospheric quality in the public imagination. The Redhead Murders became a quiet warning whispered at truck stops and roadside diners. Investigators looked at potential suspects, focusing on long-haul truckers and frequent travelers whose lives were lived in the cabs of vehicles, moving through the nights. One significant suspect emerged in the form of a man arrested in Tennessee for a similar crime. Yet the forensic bridge required to link him to the entirety of the series was never fully constructed. The investigation remained suspended in that space between strong suspicion and absolute proof, a state of perpetual almost. The mystery entered a long period of quietude as the years passed. The physical evidence remained in storage, waiting for technology that had not yet been invented. The landscape of the highways changed. The gas stations became brighter, the forests thinner, and the culture of hitchhiking all but vanished. Yet, the memory of the women found along the pavement remained. In recent years, a new generation of investigators turned to the burgeoning field of forensic genealogy. By extracting DNA from decades-old evidence and cross-referencing it with the vast digital family trees of the modern world, names began to return to the silence. One of the most profound breakthroughs occurred with the woman found in West Virginia in 1983. After nearly 40 years, she was identified as Michelle Inman. Her restoration was a moment of somber victory for her family, who had wondered for decades where their daughter had gone. It didn't solve the crime, but it answered the most fundamental question of the mystery. Another breakthrough came with the identification of a woman found in Cheatham County, Tennessee, in 1985. Her name was S.B. Pilgrim. These names act as landmarks in a once featureless landscape, providing a sense of justice for the people who had been reduced to a physical trait for 40 years. The investigation into the perpetrator continues, bolstered by the hope that DNA will eventually pinpoint the individual who moved through those mountain passes under the cover of the night. The Redhead murders serve as a sobering reminder of a specific era of American life, one where the freedom of the open road carried a quiet, underlying shadow. It is a story of long-term persistence by law enforcement and the enduring weight of cold cases that refuse to be forgotten. The red clay and the thick Appalachian forests hold these memories now, and the interstate continues to hum, a constant stream of travelers moving toward their destinations. The mystery of the Redhead murders is no longer a story of ghosts, but a story of names, science, and the slow, inevitable return of the truth. As the lights of the highway fade into the distance, the names of Michelle Inman, Lisa Nichols, and S.B. Pilgrim stand as a testament to the fact that no one is truly lost to time. The truth is patient, waiting beneath the layers of history and the shifting soil of the roadbeds. The story remains open, focused on the ongoing search for answers, honoring the dignity of those who were once strangers but are now known. Next story: the disappearance of Claudia Lawrence, York, UK, 2009. The historic city of York in the early spring of 2009 was a landscape of medieval stone, narrow cobbled shambles, and the cold, rhythmic flow of the River Ouse. The air was sharp with a lingering northern winter, carrying the scent of damp pavement, ancient brickwork, and the faint, earthy breath of the surrounding Yorkshire dales. In the district of Heworth, a quiet residential area defined by its Victorian terraces and community warmth, the pace of life was dictated by the morning commute. Claudia Lawrence, a 35-year-old chef at the University of York, moved through this world with a disciplined, reliable rhythm. She was a woman of vibrant social circles and professional diligence, embodiment of a life anchored to her neighborhood. On the evening of March 18th, she spoke with her parents by phone, her voice carrying the routine normalcy of a Wednesday night. The mystery did not begin with a disturbance, but with a silent, empty space in the morning light. On Thursday, March 19th, Claudia failed to arrive for her 6 a.m. shift at the university kitchens. Her walk to work was a route she had navigated hundreds of times, a 2-mile journey through the residential streets of Heworth as the city was just beginning to stir. Somewhere in the gray transition between her front door and the university gates, she vanished from the urban frame. There was no sign of a struggle on the pavement, no discarded belongings, and no digital trace left on the nearby cell towers. When she failed to meet a friend at a local pub that evening, the domestic safety of Heworth was revealed to have a gap that the morning mist had not cleared. The investigation was launched into a city that was suddenly aware of the shadows in its own familiar streets. North Yorkshire police combed the gardens of the terraced houses, the banks of the Ouse, and the extensive parklands near the university, looking for a singular track in the spring soil. They utilized divers to scan the cold depths of the river and helicopters to map the outskirts of the city. Yet York remained a vast, stone-faced blank. The investigative weight turned toward Claudia's private life, sifting through the layers of her professional and social interactions for a motive that had no physical manifestation. The air in a local neighborhood grew heavy with a collective, social claustrophobia. The mystery lived in the houses everyone walked past, yet no door offered an answer. The narrative of the case shifted toward the transit hubs and the potential for a journey that was intercepted by a stranger. Detectives looked for a silver Ford Focus seen in the area that morning, and a man seen on CCTV with a mysterious backpack, his gait suggesting an intimate knowledge of the Heworth shortcuts. The files of the case became a record of thousands of hours of grainy surveillance footage, looking for a singular visual anomaly in the pre-dawn shadows. But 2009 was a transition era for security. Many of the loops in the surrounding streets were overwritten before the gravity of her absence was realized. The Claudia Lawrence files grew with reports of sightings from across the country, yet each lead dissolved like the smoke from a Yorkshire chimney. Over the years, the search for Claudia has become one of the most high-profile cold cases in modern British history. Her father, Peter Lawrence, maintained a relentless, dignified vigil, turning his private grief into a legislative promise through Claudia's Law, which allows families of missing persons to manage their affairs. The atmosphere of the case has been revisited by every major investigative agency, utilizing advancements in thermal mapping and forensic genealogy that didn't exist when she walked down Haworth Road. In 2021, a new wave of atmospheric searches was launched at Sand Hutton Gravel Pits, a quiet wooded area outside the city. For 2 weeks, the air was thick with the sound of chainsaws and manual digging as forensic teams searched the water and the earth. Yet the landscape held its counsel once again. The legacy of the Claudia Lawrence case is held within the quiet, enduring hope of the city she loved. Her face remains a fixture in the shop windows of York, a landmark of a search that refused to be defeated by the decade. The architecture of the university remains, the kitchen still active, yet the void she left behind is a permanent registry of a lost future. The street where she lived remains a sought-after address, the white stucco walls glowing in the morning sun. Yet for those who know the history, the air carries a weight of reflective awareness, a reminder of the night the rhythm of the city was broken. Today, the river Ouse still flows steadily through the heart of York, timeless and indifferent to the passage of years. The narrow shambles are filled with the white light of a modern era, and the university gates open every morning at 6 a.m. But for those who remember 2009, the pre-dawn air carries a somber silence. Claudia is remembered not as a statistic, but as the bright, ambitious woman whose walk home remains an unfinished narrative. The investigation remains open, a testament to the persistent work of those who refuse to let the truth stay hidden in the shadows of the past. As the evening settles over North Yorkshire, the city sleeps with the knowledge that some secrets are kept by the stones, waiting for a definitive light to finally find the end of the road. Next story: the murder of Jill Dando, Fulham, London, 1999. The atmosphere of Fulham in the late spring of 1999 was one of suburban prestige and quiet, sun-drenched prosperity. Gowan Avenue, a street of elegant red brick terraced houses, was lined with trees coming into full, vibrant bloom, their leaves casting soft, dappled shadows on the polished cars and well-kept doorsteps. The air carried the faint scent of fresh-cut grass and the distant, rhythmic chime of church bells. In this pocket of West London, the pace of life was one of orderly routine. Jill Dando, the 37-year-old face of the BBC and a national icon of warmth and professionalism, was a fixture of this world. She moved through the neighborhood with the effortless grace of someone who was both a household name and a local neighbor, embodying a specific kind of British poise that felt as safe as it was familiar. On the morning of April 26th, the spring sun was bright, and the street was unusually peaceful. Jill had spent the morning running routine errands, shopping for a printer at Dixon's and buying a birthday card, before returning to Gowan Avenue in her metallic blue BMW. At approximately 11:32 a.m., she stepped out onto the pavement, clutching her keys and moving toward her front door. It was a mundane moment of homecoming, yet within the span of seconds, the domestic sanctuary of the street was breached. A single clinical shot was fired, a sound that several neighbors initially mistook for a car door slamming or a heavy object falling. When she was discovered moments later on her doorstep, the vibrant energy of the morning had been replaced by a silence that would stun the entire nation. The investigation began not in the dark of a basement, but in the glaring light of a high-profile media storm. Because Jill Dando was the host of Crime Watch, a program dedicated to solving the nation's most difficult crimes, the narrative carried a surreal, self-referential quality. The Metropolitan Police launched Operation Oxide, one of the largest criminal inquiries in British history. They looked through the quiet geometry of Fulham, searching for a stranger seen in the minutes following the event. A witness reported a man in a dark suit walking purposefully away from Gowan Avenue, a figure who seemed to vanish into the midday bustle of the Fulham Road. The air in London grew heavy with theories. Was this a professional hit related to her work on Crime Watch, a state-sponsored assassination connected to her recent appeal for Kosovar refugees, or the act of a single, obsessive stranger hidden in the crowd? The forensic process was a study in microscopic details and the limitations of modern science. Detectives found a singular, tiny speck of gunshot residue on the pocket of a coat belonging to a local man, Barry George. This fragment of evidence became the cornerstone of a narrative that focused on the psychology of an outsider, a man who lived on the margins of the community. In 2001, he was convicted, providing a temporary sense of resolution to a public that was desperate for answers. Yet the forensic bridge was fragile. The residence of the suspect was a labyrinth of news clippings and amateur photographs, but offered no physical proof of a firearm or a direct link to the street that morning. The conviction was later overturned in 2008, following a high court appeal that scrutinized the reliability of that singular speck of residue, leaving the case to return to its state of open mystery. Over the following decades, the search for the truth of Gowan Avenue has turned into one of the UK's most polarizing cold cases. Investigators have moved through thousands of lines of inquiry, tracking the movement of organized crime syndicates and the shadowy trails of foreign intelligence services. Every anniversary of the morning in April brings a fresh wave of theories, sifting through the layers of her professional and private life. But the streets of Fulham have kept their counsel. The files of the Metropolitan Police remain thick with contradictions, a record of a tragedy that happened in plain sight but left no permanent tracks in the urban dust. The legacy of Jill Dando is held within the continued work of the journalists and broadcasters who were inspired by her empathy. Her name is synonymous with the Jill Dando Institute of Crime Science, a center dedicated to the very forensic rigor that the case highlighted was so vital. The street itself has reclaimed its quiet dignity. Gowan Avenue is once again a sought-after address where the trees bloom every spring and the neighbors look out for one another. Yet, for those who walk past the blue front door, the air carries a weight of unfinished history, a reminder that even the most visible lives can end in a silence that the cameras cannot reach. Today, the London sun still catches the red brick of Fulham, and the Thames flows steadily nearby, timeless and indifferent to the city's change. The blue BMW and the printer ink belong to a different decade, yet the mystery of 1999 remains a living registry of the unknown. As the evening settles over West London, the neighborhood sleeps with the knowledge that the truth is often a quiet, elusive thing hidden in the shadows of the past. Jill is remembered not as a victim, but as the bright, ambitious woman whose voice defined an era of British television. The investigation remains open, a silent vigil waiting for the light to finally illuminate the person who walked away from Gowan Avenue into the anonymity of the afternoon. Next story, the Moors murders, Manchester and the Peak District, UK, 1963 to 1965. The landscape of the Saddleworth Moor in the early 1960s was a place of stark, ancient isolation, a sprawling plateau of peat bogs and purple heather that rises high above the industrial smog of Manchester. The air in this part of the Pennines is perpetually thin and sharp, carrying the scent of damp earth and the rhythmic whistling of the wind as it cuts through the gritstone outcrops known as clints. Below the moor, the city of Manchester moved with the heavy, coal-fired pulse of the textile era, a world of red brick terraces and narrow alleyways. Between 1963 and 1965, the contrast between the bustling city and the silent, brooding hills became the backdrop for a series of disappearances that would fundamentally alter the sense of safety in the north of England. The mystery did not begin with a single event, but with a growing, cold realization among the families of 5 young people who vanished from the streets of Manchester. It started with Pauline Reed, then John Kilbride, and eventually Keith Bennett, Leslie and West, and Edward Evans. The pattern was invisible to the authorities at first. Children and teenagers simply slipped out of the urban frame, leaving behind mothers and fathers who spent years waiting for the turn of the latch that never moved. The narrative of the city was one of routine: school runs, grocery trips, and weekend walks. Yet within that routine, a silver van moved through the streets, occupied by a man and a woman who projected an air of unremarkable local normalcy. Ian Brady and Myra Hindley were the architects of the silence that settled over the moor. They were an enigmatic pair who lived in a modest terrace house on Wardlebrook Avenue, surrounded by neighbors who knew them as a quiet couple with a penchant for long drives in the evening. Hindley, with her distinctive peroxide blonde hair, and Brady, with his cold, detached intellectualism, utilized the vast, shifting geography of the Pennines as a vault for their actions. The investigation only gained momentum in October 1965, when a sudden, terrifying incident at their home led the police to the realization that the missing children of Manchester had not simply run away. The search that followed was an exercise in extreme physical and emotional endurance. Detectives and hundreds of volunteers moved through the treacherous terrain of Saddleworth Moor, using long metal prods to pierce the peat, looking for anomalies in the soil. The atmosphere was one of somber, clinical focus, conducted under the gray, weeping skies of the Manchester winter. They were looking for evidence that the shifting bog had held for years. The moor is a difficult witness. The landscape is repetitive, devoid of trees or landmarks, making the recovery of specific sites a monumental task of memory and mapping. When the first discoveries were made, the quiet of the hills was replaced by a forensic vigil that lasted for months. The investigation was haunted by the presence of a singular piece of audio evidence, a recording made on a reel-to-reel tape that captured the final moments of 10-year-old Leslie and West. This harrowing artifact transformed the legal proceedings from a standard criminal case into a narrative of profound moral gravity. The trial at Chester Assizes in 1966 was conducted in a climate of total national shock, as the details of the Moors murders revealed a level of calculated, existential darkness that the post-war legal system was ill-equipped to process. The files became a record of the fragility of innocence and the capacity for 2 seemingly ordinary people to curate a world of secret violence. For decades, the case remained unfinished, held in a state of perpetual almost by the geography of the hills. While Brady and Hindley were sentenced to life, the location of Keith Bennett remained a secret kept by the Peak. The investigation was reopened in the mid-1980s, sparking a new wave of atmospheric searches that saw the perpetrators return to the moor in handcuffs, attempting to identify the burial sites amidst the featureless heather. The images of these searches, the small figures of investigators silhouetted against the vast, empty horizon, became a symbol of the UK's longest-running mystery. The silence of the moor remained largely absolute, frustrating the modern tools of radar and thermal imaging. Today, the Saddleworth Moor remains a place of pilgrimage and reflection, The wind still sighs through the tall grass, and the mist still rolls in to hide the Clint from view. The families of the victims are remembered for their extraordinary persistence and the dignity they maintained through half a century of waiting. The moors themselves have changed little. They are as ancient and indifferent as they were in 1963, a landscape that holds the memory of the industrial smoke below and the secrets of the peat within. The story of Immerse murders is a story of a landscape that serves as both a tomb and a witness. It is a mystery that highlights the enduring weight of cold cases and the commitment of law enforcement to never abandon the search for the missing. As the evening settles over the Pennines, the hills stand in quiet vigil, watched over by a history that has left its mark on the soul of the North. The world is at rest, and the moor is still, a vast expanse of purple and brown waiting for the final truth to be uncovered by the light of a future morning. Next story, the Bible John murders, Glasgow, UK, 1968 to 1969. The Glasgow of the late 1960s was a city of grit, steam, and a fierce industrial soul. The air was often heavy with the scent of coal fires and the damp mist rising off the River Clyde, creating a perpetually gray, atmospheric shroud over the tenements. On Thursday nights, the city found its release in the vibrant, neon-lit dance floors of the Barrowland Ballroom. Inside, the sound of big bands and the rhythmic shuffle of hundreds of feet filled the vast, wooden-floored hall. It was a sanctuary of music and light, where the workers of Glasgow could shed the weight of the week. But within this sanctuary, a shadow began to move, targeting women who had come to the Barrowlands for a dance and a night of escape. The mystery began in early 1968 with the discovery of Patricia Docker. She had spent the evening at the ballroom, her dark coat and sensible shoes found in the freezing morning light near her home. The scene was quiet, devoid of the chaos one might expect from a struggle, suggesting a departure from the ballroom that seemed routine until the final moment. 18 months passed before the pattern repeated with Jemima MacDonald. Again, the Barrowland Ballroom was the common thread. Again, the victim was left in a quiet lane within a mile of the music. The investigation began to focus on the anonymity of the dance floor, a place where a stranger could blend into the rhythmic crowd and vanish just as easily into the wet, midnight streets of the East End. The narrative took on a chilling, religious depth with the third victim, Helen Pudick, in October 1969. On this night, Helen had shared a taxi with her sister and a man she had met at the Barrowlands. The sister later recalled the man's intense, quiet demeanor. He had quoted scripture and spoken with a somber authority about the dens of iniquity that dance halls represented. He called himself John. By the time the taxi reached Helen's stop and she stepped out into the damp Glasgow air, the sister had a lingering sense of unease. Helen was found the next morning. Bible John was born into the public consciousness, a specter who combined the refinement of a religious scholar with the clinical violence of a predator. The investigation was the largest in the history of the Scottish police at the time. Detectives moved through the Barrowlands in suits, attempting to blend in with the dancers, sifting through the lives of thousands of patrons. A composite sketch was created, the first in Scotland to be distributed so widely, depicting a man with short, reddish-blonde hair and a distinct, lean face. It stared out from the front pages of every newspaper, a silent landmark in a city gripped by a collective, nocturnal fear. Yet, despite the thousands of calls and the scrutiny of Glasgow's boarding houses, the man from the taxi remained a phantom. He had stepped out of the light of the ballroom and into a silence that the 1960s could not break. Over the years, the Bible John case has become the most enduring cold case in the UK. Theories have flourished in the damp Glasgow nights. Some believe the perpetrator moved overseas, while others scrutinize the lives of convicted individuals who fit the profile. In the late 1990s, the potential of DNA profiling brought a surge of hope. The body of a primary suspect was exhumed, and forensic teams worked in a climate of intense national expectation. But the results were inconclusive, the genetic material too degraded by time to bridge the 30-year gap. The shadow of the man with the scripture remained untouchable, a permanent fixture of the city's folklore. Today, the Barrel Inn Ballroom still stands, its famous neon sign flickering over the Gallowgate. It is an iconic venue, once again filled with the energy of music and crowds. But for those who walk past on a cold, misty evening, the history of the late 60s still lingers in the gray stone of the neighborhood. The mystery is a reminder of the secrets that can be kept in the most crowded rooms. The victims are remembered not as statistics, but as women who lived in the vibrant, difficult heart of Glasgow. The truth of Bible John remains hidden in the archives of New Scotland Yard and the memories of a generation, waiting for the light to finally reach the back lanes of the East End. Next story, the disappearance of Lauren Spirer, Bloomington, Indiana, 2011. The college town of Bloomington in the early hours of June morning is defined by a heavy, Midwestern humidity and the quiet, blue glow of street lamps reflecting off empty limestone buildings. The vibrant energy of the school year had given way to the slower, thick air of the summer session. On the night of June 2nd, the atmosphere was one of celebration. Graduation was near, and the downtown area was filled with the rhythmic bass of music drifting from open bar doors and the steady chatter of students moving through the warm night. Lauren Spirer, a 20-year-old sophomore with a slight frame and a quick smile, was part of this nocturnal landscape, moving between friends' apartments and a local establishment known as Kilroy Sports Bar. The mystery began to coalesce during the transition from the night's festivities to the morning silence. Lauren was last captured on a security camera at a luxury apartment complex around 2:51 a.m., walking barefoot into the night, having left her shoes and phone behind earlier in the evening. Witnesses reported seeing her continue toward a street corner at 4:30 a.m., a slight figure walking alone through the shadows of the Smallwood Plaza area. When the sun rose over the Indiana University campus, the humid air remained, but Lauren was gone. The disappearance was not marked by a struggle or a scream, but by a sudden, absolute absence that left the bustling downtown area feeling hollow. The investigation was launched into a city that was suddenly on edge. Thousands of volunteers and law enforcement officers fanned out across the rolling hills of Monroe County, searching the dense woods, the local quarries, and the sprawling landfill sites that serve the region. The air in Bloomington was filled with the sound of search helicopters and the constant rustle of people moved through the brush. Detectives looked into the digital and physical tracks of everyone who had been with Lauren that night, sifting through hours of surveillance footage that caught fragments of her movement, yet never showed the moment she crossed the threshold into the unknown. As weeks turned into months, the investigation focused on the unique social geometry of a college town. Leads took investigators into the surrounding counties and beyond state lines, looking for a vehicle or a person who had been out in those early morning hours. Every quarry was scanned, every construction site scrutinized, but the Indiana earth held its secrets. The forensic evidence was sparse. The lack of a struggle at her last known location suggesting a departure that was either voluntary or chillingly efficient. The files became a labyrinth of timelines and conflicting recollections, a narrative blurred by the late-hour environment of the night she vanished. Over the years, the search for Lauren Spirer has become a permanent fixture of the Bloomington consciousness. Her parents have maintained a constant presence in the state, their advocacy for the truth serving as a beacon for other families of the missing. The mystery has been revisited by every major investigative agency, utilizing advancements in technology that didn't exist in 2011, yet the core of the case remains static. It is a story that highlights the vulnerability of the individual in the quiet, shadowed transition between a city's vibrant night and its silent dawn. Today, the intersection where Lauren was last reported remains a busy hub of student life. The limestone buildings still stand, and the humidity of the Indiana summer continues to settle over the town every June. But for those who remember, the air carries a weight of unfinished business. The search continues in the quiet efforts of cold case investigators and the persistent hope of a community that refuses to forget. The truth of Lauren's final walk remains hidden in the geometry of the Bloomington streets, waiting for a single piece of evidence to break the decade-long silence. Next story, The Lane Bryant shooting, Tinley Park, Illinois, 2008. The suburban landscape of Tinley Park in February 2008 was characterized by a biting, Midwestern chill and the quiet, orderly routine of a Saturday morning. The air was sharp with the scent of frozen pavement and the faint, metallic hint of a coming snow. At the Brookside Marketplace, a shopping center defined by its clean, modern architecture and expansive parking lots, the day began with the predictable sounds of a weekend. The distant hum of traffic on I-80 and the rhythmic opening and closing of heavy glass storefront doors. Inside the Lane Bryant boutique, the atmosphere was serene and brightly lit, a sanctuary of retail normalcy where the employees were preparing for a busy shift. But at 10:44 a.m., the quiet professional rhythm of the store was breached by an arrival that felt entirely foreign to the setting. The mystery began with a call to emergency services that consisted of a frantic, whispered plea for help. The voice on the other end was barely audible against a backdrop of chilling silence. When the police arrived minutes later, they found a scene that defied the expectations of a routine robbery. In a back storage room, tucked away from the elegant displays of a showroom, 5 women had lost their lives. A 6th woman had survived, though the psychological weight of the encounter would remain as heavy as the winter air. The perpetrator had vanished as effectively as a shadow passing through a doorway, leaving behind no digital signature, no getaway vehicle identified by the sprawling security networks of the center, and no clear motive beyond a small amount of cash taken from the register. The investigation was launched into a climate of profound regional shock. Tinley Park was a community built on a foundation of perceived safety, and the clinical nature of the crime suggested a level of planning and cold detachment that haunted the public imagination. Detectives from across the state converged on the marketplace, meticulously processing the store for a trace of a stranger. They sifting through thousands of hours of surveillance footage from the surrounding interstates and secondary roads, looking for a singular vehicle that didn't belong. They found a few discarded items and a singular DNA profile that didn't match any known database, leaving the investigation to rely on the memory of the survivor and the few forensic fragments that the winter morning had left behind. In the weeks that followed, a detailed sketch of the suspect was released. A man with a calm, methodical demeanor and a unique, braided hairstyle adorned with a single bead. This image became a fixture of the regional news, staring back from posters and television screens, yet it led to a labyrinth of dead ends. Investigators traveled as far as the East Coast and the Deep South, following leads on individuals who fit the description, but the forensic bridge between the suspect and the DNA recovered at the scene remained unbuilt. The mystery took on a persistent, rhythmic quality. Every anniversary of the event brought a fresh wave of tips, yet the truth remained obscured by the passage of time and the anonymity of the perpetrator. Over the years, the Lane Bryant store remained a closed, silent space before eventually being converted to a memorial and then reimagined for a new purpose. The memory of the women, Rhoda, Connie, Jennifer, Sarah, and Carrie, is held by a community that refuses to let the event define their lives, but rather their collective resilience. The investigation remains one of the most high-priority cold cases in the history of the Illinois State Police, a digital file that is revisited with every breakthrough in genetic genealogy and forensic science. Today, the Brookside Marketplace is once again a bustling hub of activity. The white snow falls on the parking lots just as it did in 2008, and the hum of the interstate remains constant. Yet, for those who move through the center, there's a quiet awareness of the absence left by that February morning. The case remains a testament to the persistent search for justice, a vigil for 5 lives lost in a moment of inexplicable violence. The truth is kept somewhere in the quiet files of the detectives, waiting for a final, forensic key to unlock the silence of the past. Next story, the Hammersmith Nudes murders, London, UK, 1964 to 1965. The London of the mid-1960s was a city of stark contrasts, caught between the lingering soot of the industrial past and the neon-lit energy of the swinging 60s. Away from the bright boutiques of Carnaby Street, the River Thames cut a dark, cold path through the heart of the capital. Along the Hammersmith stretch, the air was often heavy with the smell of river silt and low-tide mud, and the narrow alleyways were illuminated by a pale, yellow street lamp glow that didn't quite reach the shadows of the riverside warehouses. It was in this gritty, atmospheric environment that a series of discoveries began to unnerve a city that thought it had seen the worst of the post-war era. Between 1964 and 1965, the remains of several women were found abandoned in various quiet corners of West London. The victims were discovered in a state that stripped them of their dignity and their history, left in plain sight, but in locations that suggested a clinical knowledge of the city's nocturnal rhythms. The pattern was chilling. The women were all found without clothing, a detail that led the British press to dub the perpetrator Jack the Stripper. This wasn't the work of a disorganized mind. The scenes were devoid of traditional forensic evidence, suggesting a man who moved through the fog-drenched streets with a calculated, terrifying anonymity. The investigation became one of the largest and most complex in the history of the Metropolitan Police. Chief Superintendent John Dew Rose led a task force that operated out of a heightened, urgent atmosphere. They interviewed thousands of residents and scrutinized the lives of delivery drivers, night watchmen, and those who worked on the river. The difficulty lay in the transient nature of the victims' lives. Many were women living on the margins of society, moving through the boarding houses and basement flats of Notting Hill and Shepherd's Bush. They were women who existed in the cracks of the city's facade, and their disappearance was often not noted until the river or a construction site gave up its secret. Forensic science of the 1960s offered limited tools, yet the detectives found a strange, recurring clue. On several of the victims, traces of industrial paint were discovered, specifically a type of paint used in the automotive and manufacturing industries. This shifted the focus of the search to the sprawling industrial estates that lined the Thames, where the hum of machinery and the scent of solvent were a constant part of the landscape. Detectives moved through workshops and garages, looking for a man whose clothes carried the same microscopic flecks of color, hoping to bridge the gap between the dark riverbanks and a specific factory floor. Despite the intensity of the manhunt, the case produced no smoking gun. Suspects were identified, including a local security guard and a professional boxer. Yet the evidence remained circumstantial, a collection of coincidences that didn't quite lock into a conviction. One prominent suspect took his own life shortly after being questioned, leaving a note that suggested he could no longer live under the weight of suspicion. But his guilt was never forensically proven. The killings stopped as abruptly as they had begun, leaving the investigation to stall in the cold reality of the late 1960s. The legacy of the Hammersmith nudes remains a haunting chapter in London's history. It is a story of the other London, the one that existed beneath the glamour of the pop culture explosion, where the fog still clung to the cobblestones and the river held its breath. The victims are remembered now not as tabloid headlines, but as women who were failed by the safety of their city. Names like Hannah Tailford, Irene Lockwood, and Elizabeth Figg represent a somber registry of lives cut short in a landscape of concrete and water. Today, the Hammersmith riverfront has been transformed by modern development, lined with glass-fronted apartments and quiet walkways. The industrial paint shops are gone, and the darkness of the 1960s alleyways has been replaced by the steady, white light of LED lamps. Yet, when the mist rolls in off the Thames on a cold winter night, the atmosphere of the mystery remains. The case remains open in the annals of New Scotland Yard, a reminder that some shadows in the city's past never truly dissipate. The river continues to flow, a silent witness to a year of terror that the truth has yet to fully illuminate. Next story. The murder of Sarah Everard, Clapham to Kent, UK, 2021. The atmosphere of South London in early March 2021 was defined by a quiet, collective endurance. The city was under the stillness of a national lockdown, turning the usually vibrant arteries of Brixton and Clapham into echoing corridors of brick and pavement. The air was sharp with the remaining bite of winter, carrying the scent of damp concrete and the faint, sweet promise of early spring blossoms. In this muted landscape, the simple act of walking home became a vital connection to the world outside. Sarah Everard, a 33-year-old marketing executive with a bright, empathetic spirit, moved through this quiet urban grid on the evening of March 3rd, leaving a friend's house in Clapham around 9 p.m. She wore a bright rain jacket and moved with the purposeful pace of someone comfortable in her neighborhood, her presence captured by the rhythmic glow of street lamps and the silent vigil of doorbell cameras. The mystery did not begin with a disappearance in the dark, but with a terrifying breach of authority in the glare of the streetlights. Sarah was walking along the A205 Pointers Road, a wide, well-lit thoroughfare, when she was intercepted by a silver car. In a landscape where the police were the keepers of the lockdown routine, the encounter appeared to any passing observer as a formal stop. But as the car moved away from the city toward the dark, wooded edges of Kent, the sanctuary of the public street was revealed to have been a stage for a clinical, predatory deception. The night air grew heavy with the unasked questions of the city. When Sarah failed to arrive home, the silence of her apartment became a void that would soon spark a national reckoning. The investigation was launched into a city that was suddenly profoundly on edge. Detectives fanned out across South London, sifting through thousands of hours of grainy CCTV and ANPR data, looking for a singular vehicle that moved against the rhythm of the night. The search led them away from the vibrant light of London to the dense, silent woodlands near Ashford, Kent. In the quiet thickets of Great Chart, forensic teams in white suits worked under the heavy, gray skies of the English spring, looking for a trace of the life that had been taken from the city streets. The air in the woods was thick with the scent of pine and wet earth, a stark contrast to the urban landscape of Clapham Common. The breakthrough came with a speed that mirrored the clinical nature of the crime. The driver of the silver car was identified as a serving officer of the Metropolitan Police. This revelation transformed the narrative from a standard criminal investigation into a seismic crisis of trust. The files of the case revealed a man who had utilized his warrant card and the authority of the lockdown to stage a false arrest. The tragedy shifted from the local to the systemic, focusing on the vulnerability of individuals when the very keepers of safety become the perpetrators of violence. The Sarah Everard mystery was solved in a forensic sense, yet the human and social impact remained an open wound. As the legal proceedings unfolded, the focus shifted to the collective memory of the city. A vigil held at Clapham Common became a symbol of a movement. Thousands of women reclaiming the night air and demanding a world where a walk home was a right, not a risk. The silence of the pandemic was replaced by a powerful, communal voice. The perpetrator was sentenced to a whole life tariff, a rarity in the British legal system that reflected the gravity of the betrayal of his office. The investigation into the culture that allowed such an individual to remain in power became a permanent registry of a need for reform. The legacy of Sarah Everard is held within the quiet, respectful dignity of the tributes left for her across the country. Her name is synonymous with a cultural shift toward the safety of women and the accountability of authority. The streets of Clapham have reclaimed their routine. The street lamps still cast their warm light on the pavement, and the early spring blossoms still bloom every March. Yet for those who walk the A205, the air carries a weight of somber reflection, a reminder of the night the city's heart was breached. Today, the woods in Kent are silent once again, and the Atlantic breeze remains steady and cool as it reaches the south of England. Sarah is remembered not as a victim of a crime, but as a vibrant woman whose journey home became the catalyst for a global conversation. The investigation into the systemic failures has concluded, but the vigilance of the community remains. As the evening settles over South London, the neighborhood sleeps with the knowledge that the truth was reached through the persistence of memory and the demands of justice. The streets are calm, the city continues to move, and the name Sarah Everard remains a bright, guiding light in the ongoing search for a safer world.